Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Soch webinar. Today here we have with us Vaijayanti, who's a trans rights activist from Hyderabad. She has been very vocal about, she's been working exclusively on trans rights and inclusion of the LGBTQIA community. Though her work is mostly focused on the community, she advocates for inclusion of every person irrespective of their differences. We also have Kanav, who is pursuing his master's in developmental science. Welcome, Kanav and Vaijayanti. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. We can start with our first question. I'll be asking questions to both Vaijayanti and Kanav. And if any of you have any questions, please do comment them and we will take them at the end. Vaijayanti, the first question is for you. So you have been very outspoken about the survivor blaming that you suffered and many from the trans community continue to suffer. For a trans child, there is harassment at home, school, and community. For a teenager, it can be extremely difficult to navigate through along with puberty. How did you find the strength to plow through? Did you have any role models through the time?
I don't know if I had role models. I don't think I had. Not role models who were going through similar journeys as I, but I suppose I had people who inspired me who were not necessarily transgender in my childhood, because I didn't know the word transgender then, nor did I know words like LGBT. I'm talking about early 90s when I was in middle and high school. There was little or zero awareness those days in schools. I won't even say little, zero awareness in the 90s, early and mid, when I was in middle and high school. So I suppose the inspiration came from, say, some women which includes my own mother, because she was a survivor of severe domestic violence and abuse. And I think such examples were some inspiration. Inspiration both to walk a certain path and also not to walk a certain path that they walked.
Thank you, Vaijayanti. My next question is to Kanav. Kanav, you are currently working on a research project on the pressures that sexual minorities face. Can you elaborate a little more on that for us?
Sure. Am I audible?
Yeah.
So basically, as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm currently pursuing my master's. And the project that I'm working on is my master's thesis. I'm yet to finish it, but I've completed 11 to 12 interviews with people from all over the country who identify as sexual minorities. And I'm basically trying to understand what are the struggles that they face in their homes with the pressure to marry. And I've interviewed people who are as young as 21 and as old as 72. And I found what I've discovered so far is that the pressure to enter into heterosexual marital agreements has endured over the years, and there are people as young as 21 and people as old as 71 who have gone through this. Some of the people who I've spoken to are actually in marital agreements already with someone of the opposite sex and are leading a double life. And then there are a lot of people who are afraid that their parents will pressurize them to marry. And the pressure is so severe that it has also driven quite a lot of them also to experience mental health issues like depression, suicidal thoughts, and self-harm. So the issues are tremendous, and this is just a small subsection of society that I have spoken to. There are multiple more people who are going through similar issues and similar struggles, and it just shows that even though 377 parts of it were written down, even though we are now celebrating Pride Month, and we are now talking about same-sex marriage in the courts, the level of awareness that people have in society is still very less, and our understanding of marriage, relationship, love, intimacy is still very heteronormative and cisnormative.
Thank you, Kanav. My next question is again to Vaijayanti. So, in the book, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, Arundhati Roy vividly explains the struggle of a transgender person. She quotes a trans woman as saying that for mainstream society, the fight is outside them: good, bad, black, white. It's all outside. For us, the fight is inside. With that conflict raging within us, how can we ever be happy? When I listened to your talks and read more, I understood that this is gender dysphoria. When did you start experiencing it and how did you make peace with it?
I experience it all the time, and even now. I think people, whether or not they have gender dysphoria, experience body dysmorphia because of certain stereotypes thrust down people's throats, particularly down the throats of marginalized communities, vulnerable communities, in terms of gender, caste, class, disability, religion, ethnic status, refugee status, and so on, and the list goes on. In as much as how girls and women are made to measure themselves up to unrealistic standards of beauty and complexion and so on, which is just one example. There are many such other examples. Gender dysphoria is something that I think I was fed with a lot of morality when elders teach children things about good and bad, truth and uh, falsehood, and morality and ethics. And I acknowledge that there is nothing called universal ethics, it differs from person to person. When I was first taught about it as a child, about not to lie, not to cheat, not to, uh, things that elders teach their children, I was taught that through mythology, through mythology. Of course, I was told it literally, but because children tend to remember stories far better than maxims and rules, I was fed with a lot of Hindu as well as Buddhist and Jain mythology. Uh, so I recollect four-year-old, as a 4-year-old, when I pored over some Jataka tales and Amar Chitra Katha, as a 4, as a 5, as a 6-year-old, if not 4, I suppose at least as a 6-year-old. By then, I surely was reading. I remember having read the story, the anecdote of Uma, of Sati. Now, I'm not trying to propagate any one religion over the other. I'm just telling you what I remember out of my childhood. I saw it through pictorial descriptions of how Uma or Sati incinerated her body, her own body. She raised it to ashes. And that feeling of having burnt one's own body and incinerating it to ashes uh, liberated me, because that was the level of contempt I had for my body. Sheer contempt and disdain that I had for the body. I felt imprisoned by it. And even at that age of 6, I didn't, of course, I suppose I did feel overwhelmed in, by the sheer thought of somebody incinerating and giving over their body to flames, to be engulfed by flames. But at some level, that thought of incinerating one's body also set my mind free, that the body as a mortal frame can be destroyed. So I'm just giving you this um, violent example to tell you how severe that dysphoria was. And when I hear about gender dysphoria from people, both educated, not so educated, illiterate, across castes, classes, I have heard transgender sisters from a different faith, who could be Muslim or Christian also say, I've heard transgender sisters say, हमें रुखसत होना है इस जिस्म से. Rukhsat is to be delivered. So this is just one extreme example. That's not to say that gender dysphoria is only experienced in ways as violent as this. No. Gender dysphoria is not a constant value. There are people who experience different forms of gender dysphoria, which are much more, which are very different, and perhaps, for a lack of a better word, milder than such violent forms or manifestations of gender dysphoria.
That was very enlightening about how you experienced and how extreme it was. And for a 6-year-old to go through that must have been extremely overwhelming. Thank you so much for sharing with us. As Kanav was saying, that even though homosexuality is not criminal anymore, but the society still needs to change a lot. So after decriminalization of homosexuality, what are the things that have changed, and what are the things that you think that need to change, or we have a long way to go there? This is for either of you, whoever wants to take it.
Vijayanti,
After you, Kanav.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So what I've discovered is that even though the law changed, Section 377, parts of it were repealed, and the tabloids, the English language newspapers celebrated it. You had Bollywood celebrities talking about it in great pomp. I don't think there has been much change on the ground. I think if you talk to parents, if you talk to people who belong to the community, who are going through, who are trying to come out to their family or trying to live a life where they're not forced to marry somebody that they don't want to marry, or just try to live their true self, you see that the mindset of people has still not changed. And what I noticed from my conversations with all of these, with all of my participants, was that education seems to be something that they center their freedom towards. So they keep saying that I wish when I was younger, I was told that being a part of the LGBTQ community was not abnormal. I wish that somebody had told me that just because I'm different doesn't mean that I deserve to be treated differently. And unfortunately, when it comes to most people we interact with in uh, our family, our parents, our relatives, etc., it just seems it's very difficult. It's very difficult to explain to them who we are and what our truth is like. And this is something I've personally experienced in my family. Although I do consider myself to be more privileged since I am out to my mother and brother and my cousins as well. But I've noticed that this is not the same privilege that other people experience. And as far as 377 is concerned, yes, there are some people who belong to the privileged elite urban spaces, English language people who are fluent in English, are able to are able to have those open conversations with some of their family members. But if you really look on the ground, if you talk to people who do not have that privilege, the ground reality has not really changed very much. So I think a lot has to go, a lot has to change. Awareness is important, sensitization is important, events like these are important, but it's important that it reaches out to people, the most marginalized, and it also reaches out to people for whom English is not the first language, and this conversation is being had in English. I wish that a conversation like this could be had for people who are not fluent in this language, so that there's greater sensitization.
I'll take it ahead from there, and thank you for putting forth this point on the medium of communication. ये बहुत ही अहम मुद्दा है, ताकि हम अधिक से अधिक लोगों तक अपना संदेश, अपना जो हमारा जो पैगाम है उसे पहुंचा सकें. And allow me to now toggle between Hindi and English and perhaps Telugu as well. And some very pertinent points that Kanav has raised, they have been echoing in my mind. Of late, I've been in a digital, I don't want to call it detox, but I've not been out on social media much. And I have, there are many of us, and I don't think this is just limited to me, many of us face tendencies that are very implosive, not always just explosive, but very implosive. And I will only speak from my own personal space. There are voids and vacuums that people experience, and I have experienced. I can speak for myself, that are so huge that even if the universe were to be sucked into it, it won't fill it up. It is a void as um, big or as like a bit of a black hole. Now I'll touch upon English and जो जो ये खामियां हैं या फिर आप इसे शून्य, एक तरह का शून्य जो रहता है, वो सिर्फ अंग्रेजी तो एक पहलू है, उसके अलावा प्रिविलेज या प्रिविलेज को पता नहीं हिंदी में कैसे कहें, उसका तर्जुमा कैसे करें, जो एक आधिकारिकता कहें या आप जो भी कहें, privilege is not quite a constant, nor is it. I could be a highly privileged person if I were to compare, and I am a highly privileged person if I juxtapose myself with the average transgender hijra kinnar person who has no access to English language, who has no access to media, no access to law. At the same time, I think I'm much more disprivileged as compared to a dominant caste, privileged class, corporate gay man or cis-het man. And I suppose a gay man is much more disprivileged than ceteris paribus, other things remaining constant, with a dominant caste, privileged class, cis-het man. So at some level, we all have to acknowledge that privilege is quite relative. And it's very important to re-envision privilege in the changing contours of space and time, in the shifting surfaces of sand in which we exist. And coming to the LGBT communities, समुदायों के तहत भाषा और शिक्षा के अलावा और भी बहुत से चीजें हैं, जैसे जात हो या वर्ग हो, कास्ट, क्लास, डिसेबिलिटी, जो बहुत ही अजीबोगरीब नाम दे चुके गए हैं डिसेबिलिटी के लिए, दिव्यांग। और हमारे जो भी बहुत से दोस्त हैं जो डिसेबिलिटी से जूझ रहे हैं, जो पर्सन्स विद डिसेबिलिटीज हैं, उनका भी कहना है कि ये कैसा नाम है दिव्यांग. There are no celestial powers that we have. Divya means celestial, and ang literally translated is a limb. So it's so important to understand the impact of language and how language can be used as a tool to either perpetuate or invisibilize a marginalization. Things haven't changed much. They have changed to an extent in the letter of law. I don't know if they've changed in the spirit of law. While the Navtej Singh Johar judgment was delivered more than 2 years, 8-9 months ago in September, other than the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act and the rules framed thereunder, both of which are highly contentious, I'm not aware of a single state government out of the 28 state governments and 8 union territories, or the government of India, having done anything noteworthy to help LGBT persons and communities realize their rights. The Transgender Act is itself highly contentious, and there are large numbers of transgender persons, voices, prominent voices, many voices from within the communities that have critiqued it, that have rejected it at many levels. be it mass campaigns like Beti Padhao, Beti Bachao, or Ujjwala Gas Yojana, on which a lot of money gets spent, and I'm not critiquing it, I think it should be spent. I don't see any such mass campaigns to educate the masses on the plight of the LGBT communities. The government could have done that in these 2 years and 8 or 9 months. Also, these words as LGBT, the government is so keen to, the government of India in particular is so keen to geolocalize identities and not to use, because it wants to use an Indian term for almost everything. And we yet are grappling with these quadrants of LGBT. Nothing is so, nothing can be, it's not so watertight. It's definitely not so watertight. There are many Koti friends. The average transgender person is not Vaijayanti, in as much as the average woman is not Nayonika or any one of you here, nor is the average gay person Kanav, because we all are nevertheless privileged at some level. The average transgender person is that Kinnar or Hijra person, or that trans man, or that trans identifying intersex person who's either a landless agricultural laborer or a brick kiln worker or a construction worker and so on. So also the average gay person, and I desist from using the word average gay man, because in the lived reality of rural India, where much of our population is, I don't really know there is this idea of a cis-het man, of a cisgender heterosexual gay man, as much as it exists in urban privileged spaces. There are many Koti persons who also identify as men, who also identify at some level as transgender persons, and who are grappling with these structural inadequacies because the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act and the rules framed thereunder require them to self-identify as transgender persons, or require them to undergo surgeries and self-identify as women, which they don't. Please understand that we need to understand that in our Indian rural context, gender is not so hard and fast as it's made out to be. I suppose some states and some regions are much more patriarchal than the others, and it's not so absolute. In certain states, patriarchies manifest in ways more visible, and in certain other states, it may not be as visible, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, nor does it erase the experience of casteism, classism, or ableism, or many other forms of structural exclusions. So, right from acceptance of queer gender non-conforming children by their own families, unlike the experience of our Dalit brothers and sisters who are at least born to one Dalit parent or perhaps both Dalit parents, where the family and where parents understand what it is to be Dalit, because a Dalit child has to be born to at least one Dalit parent. The gender non-conforming child or the queer child is not necessarily born to gender non-conforming or LGBT parents. So the family is not often, it is not a source of support. The stigma begins from home. And even before it begins from the parents, the hostile conditions are so severe that the stigma begins from oneself. You know, there are so many levels at which this stigma is internalized and perpetuated within ourselves. People who are campaigning for transgender rights are at their wits' end, not all of them, but there are some of them, in as much as there are people campaigning for caste equality, unable to grapple or understand gender equality. This is, I'm sharing these examples. These are not exceptions, nor are these the only universal truth. There is nothing so binary. But what I'm trying to drive home is the point that being victimized at one level does not necessarily necessitate that person to be inclusive at all levels. I have known people, and we have all known people who come from certain marginalized backgrounds, so quite sensitive to their own struggles, and most insensitive to the struggles of other marginalized and vulnerable communities. So I think it's important to be aware of these complexities. I think it's very important for me to show myself the mirror before I call out to other persons, to ask myself how casteist, how ableist, how perhaps Islamophobic or anti Semitic or any of these or much more I am before I call out to other persons.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Vaijayanti. You also touched upon the trans persons Protection of Rights Bill 2019, and you also said about how it has been very contentious, and many influential people from the community have spoken up and spoken against the bill and have critiqued the bill. This is again open to both of you. Can you tell us or explain it to us that what are the points in the bill itself that are being critiqued by the people from the community? Because the face of the bill is that it is to protect trans persons or to protect transgenders, but the very people it strives to protect or claims to protect are critiquing it. So can you explain that?
While I catch up on my breath, Kanna, will you start and I'll follow you?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not familiar with all of the clauses in the bill, but I do remember that the clause for rape, the sentence for rape rather, is much less in the bill, and also the fact that you need to disclose your you need to have a district magistrate. What's the correct word? Verify the fact that you verify your gender, and I think that that aspect was what I remember a lot of transgender activists in pride parades were mentioning. And I remember 2 years ago when I was sitting for my entrance exams for Azim Premji University, I did read up on the trans bill at that time, and I tried to understand what was wrong with it and what the activists were trying to say. And I see that now, 2 years later, I'm about to complete my master's, and unfortunately it's still a very contentious issue. So a question that comes to my mind is, why has it taken so long? When you have people from the transgender community itself telling the government that we don't want this bill, this is not here to protect us, it is, I think it was Grace Bhanu who said, it is trying to kill us. Why do you even use the word protection? And when we ourselves, the community you claim to help, are telling you this is not what we want, why are we not consulted? And I reminds me a lot of the farmers' protests, when you have a large number of farmers themselves saying that you are here passing farm laws to protect us, and we farmers are saying no, we know that this is not going to protect us. So I think this is again what I see is that a sense of apathy, where the government is not consulting the very same people they claim to help.
Thank you. I'll pick it up from here. As Kanna conveyed, those 2 points of the necessity to get a certificate from a district magistrate, as is inherent in the statute. I must correct you both. It's no longer a bill. It is the law of the land, unfortunately, now. It's the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019, and the rules have been framed thereunder. Yes, the punishment for sexual assault makes a joke of sexual assault and I suppose it incentivizes sexual assaulters to shift their focus from cisgender, genetically, biologically assigned female persons to transgender persons, because they can get away with lesser punishment that varies from anything from that varies from 6 months to a punishment of up to 2 years, which is so not the case with Indian Penal Code section 375 and 376 that deal with sexual assault. So in some ways, it does incentivize sexual assaulters, and I and there is a lot of consensus on this, despite the dissent within transgender communities on some other issues, there is total consensus on sexual assault provisions in the Transgender Persons Protection Rights Act. Now, moving on to other provisions of the Act and rules, particularly, the rules framed require a transgender person to undergo surgery if the person wishes to transition within the gender binary. While there is no requirement to undergo surgery if the person one wishes to transition from male to transgender or from female to transgender, the expectation of a surgeon's, a doctor's certificate is implicit in the rules. If the transition is from within the gender binary, from male to female or from female to male. Now, the implementation of this act is yet a far cry, the rules as well. Out of the 28 states and 8 union territories, just about 8 states have begun some work. 20 of the other states are non-starters. And so is the case with the union territories. Sex reassignment surgery is an expensive proposition, and it should remain the prerogative of the person to whether or not it should remain the prerogative of the person to decide as to whether or not they would allow a surgeon's blade to cut through their body. Different people have different levels of gender dysphoria, and it cannot all be boiled down to sex reassignment surgery, with that becoming a toll gate of who's transgender and who's not, or who's female and who's not. We all know that there are certain self-evident truths and norms. Perhaps norm is not the right word. Self-evident truths that have now become even more abundantly obvious across the world, that gender is not what lies between the thighs of people, whether that's a lump of flesh called a penis or a pair of testicles or an orifice called vagina, but how that person envisions and identifies himself or herself or themselves, and how that person would like the society to identify him, her, or them. So the act at many levels is yet conflating gender with biological sex. It yet looks at gender through the lens of biological sex, and that is a problem. I think the idea of being transgender is by itself so revolutionary and so seems to terribly upset the apple cart of the powers that be, because if people are not regulated through patriarchal postulates of biological sex and their bodies, then the stranglehold of patriarchy loosens. So I think it's quite a discomfiting feeling for the powers that be, that wish the society to conform to certain patriarchal postulates, that they're at their wits' end to wrap their head around the idea of gender and the amorphous nature of gender. The act also seems to incentivize conversion, aversion, or reparative therapy, and I'll tell you how. While in the act, Section 3.2 of the act forbids any form of violence and has punitive measures against violence on transgender persons. The rules that tend to require transgender persons to undergo surgeries if they wish to transition within the gender binary, thus, in effect, they institutionalize aversion or conversion or reparative therapy. So I think it's important to challenge the act and rules particularly, because right now in the Supreme Court there are quite a few constitutional and legal challenges to the act, but we need petitioners to challenge the rules. And incidentally, I tail-coated Grace Banu, as I hold her in great awe. Among the constitutional challenges, the first one was Swati Bidan Barua versus Union of India, that was admitted first into the Supreme Court, which is a constitutional legal challenge to the Transgender Act. And then was Grace Banu and others, and Grace Banu along with 4 other people, and I happen to be one of the 4 other people. Then there is another constitution challenge of Rachana and others versus Union of India, which is litigated. The litigators are Human Rights Law Network. So as of now, these are the 3 challenges, constitutional challenges and legal challenges to the Act. But I think it's important to challenge the rules as well, because at that point of time, when we filed these challenges, the rules were not published in the Gazette. They were not notified in the Gazette. So it's important to catch up on that. And I leave it at that. There's so much more to speak, but for the sheer paucity of time, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Vaijayanti and Kanav, for explaining what are the exact problems, or what is the point of critique for the community with the bill. As you were explaining, you also touched upon the importance of education, about just the awareness of for a child who is different from, or who does not identify with the gender binary, to know that the difference is okay. So the education that that comes from is very important. But Vaijayanti also has been very, you have been very vocal about the harassment that you suffered at school. And this is a school that is a very privileged, and it's an elite school in Hyderabad, which is a state capital. And we can only imagine how schools are in towns and villages for children who are different from the mainstream gender binary. So how can we make our schools, because education is so important for everyone, and especially for the marginalized communities, and where if the places that where these kids get education itself are hostile, then that makes them all the more marginalized. So how can we make schools sensitive and sensitize the teachers and children to children who are different, LGBT children in particular?
I think there are structural changes that are required to happen, which may not be that easy or that quick, but we can't be waiting forever for huge changes to begin, and not start with small changes that we can begin at our own levels. The coming from the big ones to the smaller ones, education and healthcare must be protected under fundamental rights. Both these sectors must not be left predominantly in the realm of the private sector. Education and healthcare should remain both with the public and the private sector, predominantly with the public sector, because these are 2 sectors which shall enormously determine the health of our society and economy, both. But because this is an aspect on which there is, it's very difficult to get the lawmakers legislate on this. And ever since LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization, for a lack of a better word, the fetish to privatize everything and wash one's hands off is so high that it's not going to be that easy. But what can we do? I think we should use low-hanging fruits, keep pushing the boundaries of law, keep using right to education and right to information, challenge regressive moves of any government, state or central or local governments, that water down the provisions of RTI and RTE, challenge them, give representations, and if representations don't work, it's important to fuel peaceful forms of protest, very peaceful and democratic forms of protest, and side by side litigation. And that's not to say that all litigation is going to find success, but we aren't here with the hope that all our work is going to pay us rich dividends immediately. Much of our work may not even see the light of the day during our lifetime. It may not. Nothing may come out of it during our lifetime. But we are very confident that even those failures will be historic failures, and those very failures shall be the stepping stones of phenomenal successes, not necessarily during our lifetimes, but beyond. But beyond. Now, coming to what we can do at a personal level, because we can't really boil the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean on a kerosene stove. It's not possible to do that. What we can do is within our circle of influence. It's important, I think, to begin with. I have to ask myself how inclusive of my cis gay brothers and sisters am I as a transgender person? How inclusive uh, of my friends with disabilities am I? And intersections of all of these. How uh, how nuanced and how inclusive is my approach to things that I don't even know. There are times, and I wish I do this more often. There are times I sit to wonder, because 30 years ago, I didn't know, nor did my parents know anything about LGBT activism 30 years ago. And I sometimes sit down to ponder if there are other forms of social exclusion that I don't even know, exist, which 10 years or 20 years from now, I may have a curtain raiser. I may have an eye opener to realize that 20 years ago, I was so exclusive and hostile to certain marginalized communities. So I keep thinking about that, because 30, 40 years ago, I didn't know anything about LGBT activism, nor did I know anything much about the environment. Of course, environment was taught at a very perfunctory way in schools, but this level of awareness on the need to reduce fossil fuels, the need to leave less carbon footprint, the need to not use plastic, the need to separate bio waste from uh, degradable bio waste from non-degradable waste. This wasn't there as much 30 years ago. So it's very important to keep scratching one's head, to think, to keep showing oneself the mirror, to ponder, to never hesitate to say sorry if one has gone wrong. There is absolutely no shame in apologizing when one goes wrong, and these are the only things that come to the top at the top of my mind. I'm done.
If I could add something.
Yes, please.
So, right at the beginning, if you remember, I spoke about how a lot of my research participants kept talking about education. And one of the things that was a very common theme in my interviews with them was the fact that when they were young, when they were in school, there was no conversation about sexuality, about gender. It was, you were told that there is a certain way to behave, and that is how you were supposed to behave. And those same norms and values were also followed at home. And so for those people who were different, they were either bullied or were forced to stay quiet. And that is the lived experience of a lot of queer people. And of course, the nature of bullying and harassment is very different for different people. I'm also associated with an organization that's currently trying to collect research work done by queer students and students interested in queer literature and queer academics. And I recently read a couple of papers written by some young scholars who are who are interested in the domain of queer education. And I found a lot of interesting answers to some of the questions that you had asked about queering education, or how to make the education system more inclusive of people who are from the LGBTQ community. What I've noticed is that the problem is very, very deep. It's very structural, as Vijayanti also pointed out. The people who are in positions of power themselves do not want to acknowledge gender differences, want to hold on to gender binaries. And so to challenge, to talk about gender and sexuality in academic institutions or in schools would require training them first. And also, it's another important point is intersectionality, because it's not just about queerness, it's also about caste, it is about disability, and about how all of this intersects. So you could be a Dalit person who happens to be queer, or you could be from the DBA community who's queer, you could be disabled and queer. And so all of these intersections are important, and understanding all of these intersections is important to provide a more wholesome education, a more wholesome curriculum. But I think we still have a long way to go. Just a few days back, I did a talk, a pride talk with some students in a pretty well established school in Kolkata. They're currently in class 11, and I asked them about whether in their school they talk about gender and sexuality, and the answer was no. And so what these students did was they formed a club of their own, and they tried to speak about gender and sexuality, but outside of their outside of the four walls of their school. So this is quite troubling, because as somebody who's who passed out of school many years ago, if now in 2021 you have people who are in school, who are in class 11, class 10, in places like Central Calcutta or South Calcutta and so-called elite institutions where these conversations are not happening, imagine the state in other schools of the country. We still have a very long way to go.
Yeah, so as Vaijayanti was also sharing, you spoke about how bringing these kids, making education and healthcare accessible will bring more kids to school. That is one side of the problem. The other side is once they come into schools, how are they being treated and how inclusive are the schools being? And as Kanav rightly said, we still have a long way to go, because what stories we hear from are from elite schools. We are not even hearing the stories of schools in towns, schools in villages. So we can only, if the stories from the cities are so catastrophic or so horrifying, then we can only imagine what the stories of LGBTQ community kids are from villages and towns. Thank you so much. I think with that, we come to the end of this webinar. And thank you so much, Vaijayanti and Kana, for joining us. It has been a very enlightening last 1 hour for all of us. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and also your learnings and your insights. To the everyone who has been viewing the webinar, the video will be there on our FB page and you can go through it later as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Monica, Voice for Girls, and Vaijayanti. It was really nice hearing all of you and talking to all of you, and of course, the lovely audience.
Yeah, thank you, Voice for Girls and Kanav. Kanav, I've sent you a message on the messenger. Please take a quick peek at